Marry her. I'd rather end my life. Once the paperwork clears, she belongs to the broker. My debt disappears, and I walk away clean. Amira didn't drop her phone. She didn't gasp. She just sat very, very still. The way a person goes still when the ground beneath them has already fallen and they haven't started screaming yet. The voice memo had been an accident. David's phone had slipped between the couch cushions the night before, screen down, silent, while he went out for his monthly dinner with the boys. She'd found it that morning wedged beside a throw pillow, vibrating softly with a low battery alert. She'd plugged it in without a second thought. She wasn't the kind of woman who searched for proof of a fire. She'd never needed to be. David was boring, predictable, safe. That was precisely why she had chosen him. Amira was a senior corporate auditor. She spent her days inside other people's secrets. Buried ledgers, falsified accounts, invisible trails of money that men assumed no one would ever follow. She was extraordinary at her job and deliberately mediocre everywhere else. She'd learned early that brilliant women made men nervous and nervous men left. So she wore beige. She pulled her hair back. She laughed at his jokes and pretended his opinions were original. She had made herself small and rectangular, like a key shaped to fit a very ordinary lock. She had 37 wedding invitations sitting in a box by the door, addressed and stamped, waiting to be mailed tomorrow. She almost didn't open the file. It was 41 minutes of ambient noise, bar sounds, laughter, the clink of glasses. Auto-saved from David's pocket during the dinner she hadn't been invited to. A glitch. A ghost recording. The kind of accidental data her training told her always contained what official statements were designed to bury. She pressed play and folded her legs beneath her on the couch, one hand wrapped around her cooling coffee. For the first 14 minutes. Nothing. Sports scores, a promotion someone had gotten, a debate about a restaurant. The ordinary, comfortable texture of men who had never once been afraid of anything. Then one of them asked, "So, 6 months out. You nervous?" David. 6 months. Yeah. Not excited. Not the voice of a man counting down toward the best day of his life. Something flatter. Something she'd heard in boardrooms when companies were preparing to file for bankruptcy and needed someone to sign off on the numbers. "You don't sound like a man who's about to get married." A long pause. The kind of pause that had shape and weight and edges. "The syndicate's patience ran out," David said, very quietly. "So, here we are." Amira set down her coffee. "She doesn't know?" "She trusts me," David said, and he laughed, soft, almost fond, the way you'd describe a loyal dog who doesn't know it's being walked to the pound. That's always been her problem. Once the paperwork is signed at the end of the month, she belongs to the broker. My debt clears, I walk. The recording kept going for another 23 minutes. Amira didn't hear any of it. She was already at David's laptop. Have you ever made yourself small just to keep a man comfortable? If you've ever shrunk your brilliance to fit into a mediocre relationship, this story is your wake-up call. Welcome to Afro-Korean Storyverse. Hit that subscribe button right now and don't look away, because Amira is about to show David exactly what happens when you try to sell a woman who already holds the keys to your destruction. The ledger was elegant in the way that truly terrible things often are. David had built it meticulously, the kind of financial architecture that took months, maybe years, to construct with such deliberate layers of distance between the visible and the real. Amira moved through it the way she moved through every corrupted set of books she'd ever been handed, quietly, without emotion, following the thread. Shell company in the Caymans feeding into a holding entity registered in Luxembourg, bleeding into a numbered account in Singapore that didn't correspond to any legitimate business activity she could identify. Clean on the surface, immaculate even, the work of someone who understood how money moved and assumed no one else did. He'd underestimated her. He always had. That had always been his problem. She found the syndicate's name 32 minutes into the dig. buried 4 layers deep inside a loan agreement dated 19 months ago. The principal was staggering. Not impossible for a man of David's income, but the interest structure was predatory in the specific architectural way that told her this wasn't a bank, wasn't a private lender, wasn't anything operating inside a legal framework. This was a marker held by someone who collected debts the way other men collected art. Slowly, deliberately, and with complete indifference to suffering. Yoongi. She had seen that name once, before in a professional context. A footnote in a financial intelligence brief her firm had received during an audit of a sole-affiliated investment group 3 years ago. The brief had been 6 pages. 5 of them were redactions. The one page that remained described Yoongi in the careful, drained language of people who were professionally required to be precise, but personally terrified. Subject maintains significant financial and operational influence across multiple jurisdictions, with suspected control of legitimate business fronts in hospitality, private security, and real estate. No successful prosecutions to date. No successful prosecutions to date. She found the collection schedule at the bottom of a folder David had named, with breathtaking audacity, miscellaneous admin. A message thread, partially encrypted between David and a contact listed only as the broker. Dates, logistics, a street address she didn't recognize. And at the top of the thread, in plain text, a timestamp. 48 hours. Amira sat back and looked at the ceiling for exactly 10 seconds. She allowed herself that. 10 seconds of feeling the full weight of it. The 3 years, the invitations by the door, the way she had sanded herself down to fit the shape of a life built on a lie. She felt it completely, the way you have to feel a thing completely before you can put it down and move. Then she closed the laptop and started thinking. The police were not an option. She'd audited enough municipal contracts to understand the texture of institutional compromise, and a man like Yoongi didn't maintain 19 months of clean operation in a city this size without having friends in departments that mattered. Running was not an option. The broker had her address, her routines, possibly her photograph. She had no family within 2,000 miles and no friend whose couch was worth more than her life. What she had was information. David's offshore architecture was worth, conservatively, 8 figures to anyone who wanted to dismantle it or inherit it. She knew where every account was, every routing number, every shell entity's registered director. She knew the passwords. She knew the filing codes. She had walked into David's financial life the same way she walked into every client engagement, thoroughly, precisely, and without being asked, because that was simply how her brain worked. She had never thought to use it against him. She had never imagined she'd need to. She pulled up a private browser and found the address of a club she'd seen referenced twice in the broker's message thread. Not the main entrance. The back entrance. The one the thread mentioned only obliquely, in the context of collections and deliveries. She wrote it on the inside of her wrist in ink, the way she used to write exam formulas in university when she didn't trust herself to remember under pressure. Then she changed into the black dress, put on the only heels she owned, that were designed for standing still and looking like you own the room, and walked out of the apartment into the cold city night. The club had no sign. That was the first thing she registered. No name, no number, just a black door on a street that felt deliberately unmemorable, sandwiched between a closed dry cleaner and a parking structure. The second thing she registered was the 2 men stationed outside it, who were built like they had been specifically designed to discourage exactly the kind of thing she was attempting to do. She didn't slow down. "I need to see Yoongi." The larger of the 2 men looked at her the way people look at weather events, not with hostility, exactly, but with the flat assessment of something that needed to be dealt with and then forgotten. "No appointments, no entry." "I'm not here for a drink." She held his gaze. She'd spent a decade in rooms full of men who expected her to look away first and had stopped doing it somewhere around year 3. Tell him a corporate auditor is standing outside his door with the complete financial architecture of the man who owes him $4 million. Tell him she has 47 hours before she stops being available to have this conversation. Tell him exactly that. A long pause, the kind she was becoming familiar with. The man's eyes moved to the second guard. Something passed between them. Not words. Something smaller and faster. Then he pressed 2 fingers to the earpiece she hadn't noticed until now and repeated her message in a low murmur, nearly verbatim. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she started doing arithmetic in her head to keep her breathing steady. Then the door opened. The interior was not what she expected, and she'd spent the walk over deliberately constructing no expectation so she wouldn't flinch at whatever she found. Dark? Yes. Low amber lighting, the kind that made everyone look like a secret. Quiet, despite the number of bodies she registered in her peripheral vision, all of them carrying themselves with the particular stillness of men who had been trained to wait. Expensive? The kind of expensive that didn't announce itself, but that she could read the way she read balance sheets. Not in the price tags, but in the restraint. She was walked through 2 rooms and a corridor and into a private office where the air was cooler, and the ambient noise of the club reduced to a distant, manageable pulse. Yoongi was standing at the window when she was brought in, his back to her. Dark suit, perfectly cut, the kind of tailoring that understood the difference between fitting a body and being built for it. She clocked the ink at his collar before he turned, the edge of something elaborate and dark curling upward past his jawline, disappearing beneath the fabric like a chapter of a story she wasn't meant to read yet. When he turned, she understood immediately why his name appeared in financial intelligence briefs. Without adjectives. He didn't need them. His face was the adjective. Sharp, composed, ferociously still. The face of someone who had not been surprised in a very long time and was waiting, with mild interest, to see if she'd be the first. "You have 47 hours, he said. Not a question. 46 and a half now. She didn't sit. He hadn't offered. Your money is in 6 accounts across 4 jurisdictions. I have the routing numbers, the shell company registrations, the filing codes, and the passwords. All of it is currently in my memory and on an encrypted drive that will forward itself to 3 different federal financial crime units in 46 hours, unless I personally cancel the transfer." She watched his face. Nothing moved on it. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you a transaction. You cancel my collection, you get everything I know about David Park's financial architecture, and I disappear. Clean exchange." Yoongi looked at her for a long moment. Then, he did something she hadn't anticipated. He smiled. Not warmly, not with cruelty. With the specific quality of a man who had been waiting for a particular conversation to finally arrive. "Amira," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth said with that particular weight, like he'd said it before, in other rooms, without her present, stopped something in her chest. "Sit down." She sat. "I know about David's accounts." He moved to the desk with the unhurried precision of someone who had never once needed to rush toward anything. "I've known for 8 months. I let him run because watching a man build his own gallows is more efficient than building it for him." His eyes hadn't left her face. "What I didn't have was someone who could dismantle the architecture legally without leaving a forensic trail back to my organization. You can do that. I can. I also know," he said, "that you flagged the Meridian account discrepancy during the Soltech audit. 3 years ago. The Meridian account." She remembered it. A mid-sized anomaly in an otherwise clean set of books that she'd flagged almost as a reflex, the way you correct a spelling error you spot on the street. She'd never known what happened to the flag after she submitted it. "That filing," Yoongi said, "prevented a federal seizure of 3 of my legitimate holdings. You saved me, conservatively, $40 million. You had no idea you did it. You were just doing your job." He studied her face. "I've had eyes on you since then. I watched you stay with a man who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as you. I found it. A pause, controlled and deliberate. Frustrating. The room was very quiet. Your offer, he said, is inadequate. I don't need the accounts. I need something else. He opened a drawer and placed a document on the desk between them. She recognized the format before she read the heading. I need a wife. She looked at the document, then at him. Legal marriage. My name makes you untouchable. No syndicate, no broker, no debt collector in this city will touch a woman under my protection. In return, you spend 6 months as my wife in visible public capacity. Attend 3 events. Sign 4 documents. After 6 months, quiet dissolution. You walk away with your freedom, your safety, and a financial settlement that would make your current salary look like a rounding error. He sat down, completely unhurried. The alternative is, you spend the next 46 hours trying to outrun people who are very good at finding women who run. Amira looked at the document. She thought about the beige cardigans in her closet. She thought about the wedding invitations by the door. She thought about the 10 seconds she'd allowed herself on the ceiling and how, in those 10 seconds, part of her had already known that the only way out of this was through. You'd need a prenup, she said. Something shifted behind his eyes. Almost amusement. Almost. Already in the appendix. She picked up the document and read every word of it. He waited without fidgeting, without checking his phone, without doing anything at all except watching her with the patient intensity of a man who already knew what she was going to decide and was simply allowing her the dignity of arriving there herself. She reached the final page, found the signature line. If you breach the terms, she said, the federal forward goes out anyway. Understood. And I want it written that I retain full professional autonomy. I work, I keep my clients. My firm doesn't know about any of this. Page 7, Clause 4. She looked up. He had the expression of a man who had drafted this document with a specific person in mind, and had known her well enough to anticipate every condition she would name. That should have frightened her. Somehow it didn't. She picked up the pen. They signed at 1:14 in the morning. Young-gi signed first. A clean, unhurried signature that suggested a man, before a storm commits to itself. He, before a storm, commits to itself. He called in 2 witnesses, men who materialized from the corridor without being summoned aloud, signed where indicated, and disappeared again with the professional efficiency of people who had witnessed things in this room that made a marriage contract seem routine. One of them handed her a phone, new, preloaded with a single contact labeled only GI. Don't use it unless you need to, Yoongi said, but if you need to, use it immediately. Don't wait until you think it's bad enough. If something feels wrong, that is already bad enough. She looked at the phone, then at him. When do your men? They're already outside your building. He said it without drama, the way you'd confirm a meeting time. They have been since an hour before you arrived here. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the fact that somewhere between David's message thread and this desk, she had stopped being a woman who was about to be collected and had become something else entirely. She hadn't fully processed what yet, but she could feel it. A new geometry to her situation, wider and stranger and infinitely more dangerous in directions she hadn't yet mapped. One thing, he said, and she paused with her hand on the document. His voice had shifted. Not softer, exactly, but different. Carrying something heavier than business. For the next 24 hours, you go back to your apartment and you act as if nothing has changed. You smile. You have dinner with him if he suggests it. You do not let him know that you know. His dark eyes were completely steady on her face. Can you do that? She thought about 3 years of making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of safe. Thought about all the things she had already been doing without knowing she was doing them. Performing normalcy, flattening her edges, staying inside lines she hadn't drawn. Yes, she said. "I've had practice." The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Invitations by the door, wedding binder on the table, the domestic evidence of a life she'd been building on a foundation that was never there. David was already home. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of him in the kitchen, the refrigerator opening, the soft percussion of someone who believed he was completely alone and unobserved. She had less than 3 seconds to become the woman he thought she was, and she used all 3 of them. "Hey." She hung up her coat with steady hands. "Sorry. I went for a walk. Couldn't sleep." David appeared in the kitchen doorway with a glass of water and the face of a man with nothing on his conscience because he had cauterized the part that produced one. "You okay? You look pale." "Pre-wedding nerves," she said, and smiled in the way she'd been smiling at him for 3 years. Slightly behind the eyes, constructed with care. "Is that weird to say?" "Little bit." He smiled back. He looked relaxed. Relieved, she realized now, the specific relief of a man whose timeline was moving exactly as planned. "Come to bed. You're overthinking again." "You have no idea what I'm doing." "Yeah," she said. "You're right." She slept on her side of the bed with her spine perfectly straight and her eyes open in the dark, listening to David's breathing slow and settle into sleep beside her. On the nightstand, the new phone sat face down under her original phone, hidden in plain sight the way all the best secrets were. At 3 a.m., she rose quietly and moved to the closet. She'd been mentally cataloging for hours. What she needed, what she could leave, what she could not risk David noticing was gone. Passport. The small emergency cash reserve she'd kept in a travel pouch since she was 22, not because she'd ever planned to run, but because she'd always, somewhere very deep and practical, known that she might need to. Her external hard drive. 3 changes of clothes. Not the beige, not the sensible. She didn't need those anymore. She was folding the black dress when she heard the floor creak. Her hands stopped. Every nerve in her body went absolutely still. "Amira." David's voice from the doorway. Not alarmed, not accusatory. Still thick with half sleep, questioning. She turned around with the dress held against her chest, her heartbeat enormous in her ears, and arranged her face into something confused and soft. "Sorry," she whispered. "Couldn't sleep. Was just... I want to pack the things I'm taking to the hotel the night before the wedding now so I don't stress about it later. You know how I get." He looked at her. At the half-filled bag on the floor. At her face. "Read me," she thought. "I dare you. Look at everything I am and see any of it clearly. You never have." "Come back to bed," he said finally. "You're doing too much." "I know." She put the dress down. Moved toward him. Let him pull her back to bed and settle his arm around her with the comfortable possessiveness of a man who believed, with total confidence, that everything was still going according to plan. She lay there in the dark listening to him sleep and thought about a signature on a document and a phone face down on her nightstand and men she hadn't seen who were standing outside her building in the dark. 44 hours. She could be still for 44 more hours. She had been still her entire life. The difference now was that the stillness had a direction. The next morning arrived gray and ordinary, the kind of morning that had no interest in the magnitude of what it contained. Amira made coffee. She made enough for 2, the way she always did, and set David's mug on his side of the counter with the particular care of a woman who had not yet been collected and therefore still had a performance to maintain. She showered. She dressed in a cream blouse and dark trousers. Not beige, but close enough that David wouldn't register the difference. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open to a spreadsheet she had no intention of actually working on, and she waited. She was running through routing numbers in her head for the 4th time, not because she'd forgotten them, she never forgot numbers, but because the repetition steadied her. When her phone vibrated once. Not the new phone. Her regular one. A message from a number she didn't recognize. "Don't go to the pharmacy on Crescent this afternoon." She stared at it. Then she understood. She'd had a prescription pickup scheduled. Something she'd mentioned to no one except David 2 days ago, in passing, while he was apparently already coordinating her handover with the broker's timeline. The collectors had done their homework. They'd mapped her routine and found a seam in it. A window, mid-afternoon, when she'd be 2 blocks from the apartment, and isolated enough to make a clean grab look like nothing at all. She typed back, "Understood." Deleted the thread. She didn't go to the pharmacy. What happened on Crescent Street that afternoon, she learned in fragments over the following hours. Not from the news, which reported nothing, and not from David, who was at his office performing the last act of a man with a life he intended to keep. She learned it from a single follow-up message on the new phone, 4 words long. 2. Both walking. Contained. She sat with that for a long moment. Contained. The word was doing a great deal of quiet work. She thought about the men who had been standing outside her building in the dark without her ever seeing them. Thought about the particular kind of organizational architecture required to intercept a collection attempt on a public street in the middle of the afternoon and leave no body, no report, no visible evidence that anything had occurred at all. She thought about Yoongi signing that document at 1:14 in the morning with complete unhurried calm, already knowing that his people were already in place, that the protection she'd bargained for had been in motion before the ink was dry. She thought, he takes contracts seriously. She thought, good. David came home at 7 with flowers, which was new, and which told her everything she needed to know about the specific texture of his guilt and his relief, and his absolute certainty that tomorrow morning he would be free. The flowers were dahlias, her favorite, and the fact that he remembered and deployed that detail now, at the end, made something cold and clarifying move through her chest. "I made a reservation," he said. "Tomorrow night. Somewhere nice. I thought we deserved a proper dinner. All the wedding stress, you know. Just us." She looked at the flowers. She looked at his face, the careful ease of it, the performance of a man who was very good at performing and had always assumed she was too grateful to. For a long time, watching the light come for a long time, watching the light come across the city. Ordinary morning light, indifferent to ledgers and brokers and the classified geography of underground venues. She dressed slowly and with great intention. Not the cream blouse. Not anything in her closet that belonged to the woman she'd been performing for 3 years. She had moved the bag. After David had fallen back asleep 2 nights ago, she'd repacked it quietly and walked it to the building's rear stairwell. 3rd landing, behind the utility panel. A hiding place she'd identified on her first week in the apartment because she was the kind of woman who always, quietly, identified the exits. Yoongi's people had collected it yesterday without her needing to ask. She didn't know how they knew. She had stopped being surprised by what they knew. So she dressed from almost nothing. A simple dark wrap that she'd bought 2 years ago for a work function and never worn because David had made a face at it, she'd chosen to interpret as neutral. Her hair down. The single pair of earrings she owned that were not sensible. She looked in the bathroom mirror at a woman who looked like herself, maybe for the first time in a long time, and held that for a moment before she went back out. David was in the kitchen, suit already on. He looked good. She registered that the way she registered everything now, with the flat precision of observation uncoupled from feeling. He was dressed for a celebration. He'd chosen his best suit for the night he delivered her to strangers and walked away clean. "You look beautiful," he said. "Thank you," she said. "What time's the reservation?" 8:30. "I'll drive." Of course he would. They had dinner first at a restaurant that was genuinely excellent. The kind of place where the service was invisible. And the menu was 4 lines per page and the wine was chosen with real knowledge. She ate everything. She drank sparingly. She let him talk about the upcoming honeymoon, about his plans for the back half of the year, about a new investment opportunity he was vague about in the way. He was always vague, and she nodded at appropriate intervals with the expression of a woman who believed in the future he was describing. He was a good storyteller. She'd always known that. She understood now that it was the primary skill of men like him, not construction, but narration. Not building things, but describing them so convincingly that no one thought to check if they existed. At 9:15, he paid the bill and said he wanted to show her somewhere. A client's private event. A quick appearance. Nothing formal. She'd love it. Of course, she said. She picked up her clutch. The small one, with nothing in it except the new phone and her lip color and her passport, which she'd been carrying, on her person for 36 hours. I'm ready. The drive took 22 minutes. She tracked the route without appearing to, registering turns, landmarks, the gradual shift from restaurant district to industrial quiet. The building they arrived at looked like a logistics company. Ground floor loading bay, no windows, a row of black cars parked with the deliberate spacing of vehicles belonging to people who didn't want their plates adjacent to one another. She recognized the architecture of concealment. She'd been reading it for 2 days. David pulled up to the entrance and stopped the car. Wait here a moment, he said. I need to check something inside. I'll come get you. She looked at him. Okay. He got out of the car. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the entrance without looking back, and she watched him through the windshield. The set of his shoulders, the particular forward lean of a man moving toward something he wanted. And she thought about Dahlia's. And 3 years and the 10 seconds on the ceiling when she'd allowed herself to feel it completely before putting it down. She'd put it down. She gave him 4 minutes. Then she got out of the car, and she walked to a different entrance. One she'd been given in a message at 7 a.m. that she'd read and deleted, and she pressed a single button on the new phone. Ready. The response was immediate. So are we. Inside the building, past the utilitarian exterior, the space transformed. The way certain things in this city transformed, once you were past the layer designed to discourage scrutiny. Deep ceilings, low light, the ambient noise of money and danger moving together in a room, the particular cocktail of both that she'd been learning to read for 48 hours and could now identify the way she identified falsified accounts, by the specific smell of concealment. The main room was arranged with the logic of theater. A central floor. Tiered seating along the walls. Men in dark, suits holding glasses, talking with the careful ease of people conducting business in a room where business was conducted in no official language. At the far end, elevated slightly, a VIP section separated by smoked glass where she could see, through the distortion, the shape of David already seated, already with a drink, already leaning toward the woman beside him. The mistress she registered, the one the message thread had mentioned. He was laughing. His shoulders were back. He looked like a man who had just put down a very heavy thing. Nobody had noticed Amira yet. She stood at the edge of the room for exactly long enough to understand its geography. Then she moved to the side corridor where 2 of Yoongi's men were waiting, and they handed her the bag she'd packed 2 nights ago in a darkened closet, and she went into the anteroom, and she stopped being the woman David had brought. The dress was the one she'd described as her own transformation, the one that had been waiting in her wardrobe for an occasion that was finally adequate to it. Deep burgundy, silk, structured at the shoulder and fluid everywhere else, the kind of dress that understood that power and elegance were not competing aesthetics. Her hair was already down, the earrings were already in. The only thing left was the decision to walk into the room as exactly who she was, without apology, without reduction. She'd been practicing that decision for 36 hours. She was ready. The doors opened from the inside. The room didn't go silent immediately. Silence in rooms like this propagated from the center outward, the way a stone dropped in water displaced everything in expanding rings. The first people to see were closest to the entrance, and their stillness spread, and then the conversations peeled away one by one, and in the space of about 15 seconds, every set of eyes in the room had completed its migration from wherever it had been to the doorway where Amira stood. Beside Yoongi. He was in black, perfectly tailored, open at the collar, the dark ink visible at his throat. And he was not looking at the room. He was looking only at her, with the specific quality of attention of a man who had waited a long time for a particular thing and was finding the reality of it more than adequate to the anticipation. His hand was at the small of her back, proprietorial, deliberate, the gesture of a man communicating ownership to an entire room without using language. The broker was on his feet. She registered that first. The compact, sharp-featured man near the central floor, who had the look of someone doing rapid arithmetic on a situation that was not resolving the way he'd planned. She didn't look at him yet. She was looking at the VIP section. Through the smoked glass, she could see David processing the information in real time, the way the body absorbs a shock before the mind catches up, the slight forward lean, the glass pausing halfway to his mouth. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. "For those who don't know my wife," he said into the silence that the room was offering him like a gift. "Her name is Amira. She is a senior corporate auditor. She is extraordinarily good at her job." A pause. "She has spent the last 36 hours doing it." Amira reached into her clutch and produced a slim tablet. She'd prepared the interface herself. Clean, clear. The kind of presentation she gave in boardrooms where she needed complex information to be legible to people who didn't speak her first language of numbers. "David Park," she said, and the sound of her own voice in that room, steady, carrying, completely without tremor, was the most honest thing she'd said in 3 years. "Outstanding debt to this organization, $4,200,000. His accounts are as follows." She turned the tablet so that the room could see the figures, the routing numbers, the shell companies, the Singapore account, the Luxembourg holding entity, all of it unspooled in clean sequential lines. "All of which," she said, "as of 11 minutes ago, have been transferred into the custody of my husband's organization, in full settlement of the debt, plus applicable interest." She tilted her head very slightly. "With a remainder, after settlement, of approximately 2.1 million, which we are donating to a victim support foundation whose details I'm happy to provide." In the VIP section, David had stood up. She could see him through the glass, the mistress beside him with her hand on his arm, David ignoring it, David's face doing something she didn't have a word for. The face of a man watching his own obituary read aloud while he was still in the room. "He also," Amira continued, her voice even and precise as a blade, "coordinated the attempted trafficking of at least one additional individual through the broker currently standing to my left, whose communications I have documented in full and which have been forwarded to 3 federal financial crime units on a delayed release. The delay is set to cancel automatically in 20 minutes. She looked at the broker directly for the first time. "Unless I cancel it, which I will, in exchange for the documented release of every obligation in his ledger and the signed withdrawal of his organization from any further activity involving David Park or his associates." She paused. "He has 20 minutes to decide." The broker looked at Yoongi. Yoongi looked back at him with the expression of a man watching something boring conclude. The broker put down his glass, straightened his jacket, and nodded. David was brought out of the VIP section by 2 men who materialized at his elbows with the choreographed timing of people who had been waiting there for some time. He looked at Amira with an expression she found genuinely difficult to categorize. It contained grief and fury, and the specific bewildered outrage of a man who had calculated every variable and somehow omitted the most important one. "You," he started. "Your assets are frozen," she said calmly. "Your accounts are gone. Your debt is mine. You are not." She held his gaze for exactly long enough to let him understand that she was looking at him clearly, completely, without the filter of 3 years of willful gentleness, and that what she saw did not distress her. "Goodbye, David." He was still trying to form words when they walked him out. The penthouse was quiet in the particular way that very high places are quiet, the city still audible far below. a continuous low frequency that was almost like silence from a sufficient distance. Amira stood at the floor-to-ceiling window and watched the lights and let the adrenaline move out of her body by degrees, the way a storm exhausts itself without apology. She heard Yoongi behind her, the quiet of him, the specific quality of his stillness in a room, which she had spent 2 days calibrating and could now read the way she read silences in audio recordings. He was not a man who filled space unnecessarily. He didn't speak until he had something to say. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "In there." "I prepared. I've had people prepare." He came to stand beside her at the window, not close enough to crowd the space, close enough that she was entirely aware of him. Preparation doesn't always hold when the room is looking at you. She thought about what had held her steady, the routing numbers she'd repeated like a prayer, the 10 seconds on the ceiling, the pen in her hand at 1:14 in the morning in a room full of people who moved like shadows, and a man who had known her name before she said it. "I stopped being afraid somewhere around the second day," she said. "I'm not sure exactly when." "I know when," he said. She looked at him. "When you signed the document," he said simply. "I watched it happen." The city moved below them, indifferent and continuous. She thought about the contract, the 2 witnesses who materialized and disappeared, the phone with a single contact, the men who had stood outside her building in the dark, and the ones who had intercepted 2 collectors on Crescent Street, and the word contained doing its quiet, devastating work. She thought about a man who had been keeping tabs on her for 3 years because she'd filed an audit flag as a reflex, the way she corrected errors on the street, and who had watched her make herself small for a man who sold her, and had found it, in his word, frustrating. "The 6 months," she said. "Yes." "The contract terms." "Still in effect," he said, "if you want them to be." She turned to look at him fully. The sharp jawline, the dark eyes that missed nothing, the ink at his collar that she understood now was not decoration, but a record. The way her own memory for numbers was a record. Everything she'd survived written into her body and carried forward. He was looking at her with the expression she'd first seen in his office when she walked in and refused to slow down. Not surprise. Something more interior than that. The look of a man arriving somewhere he'd been navigating toward for a long time. "I'm a corporate auditor," she said. "I know. I work. I keep my clients. My firm doesn't know." Page 7, Clause 4. "I want to renegotiate the timeline." Something moved behind his eyes. 6 months was always a floor, he said quietly, not a ceiling. She turned back to the window. Below them, the city was doing what cities did. Running its continuous, complicated machinery of debt and transaction and survival, all those hidden ledgers balancing and failing and beginning again. She had spent her career inside other people's secrets. She was beginning to understand that she had somehow wandered into the most interesting one she'd ever encountered. She had walked into a lion's den with nothing but numbers in her head and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had finally run out of reasons to be small. She had walked out as something else entirely. "The marriage of convenience," she said. "Yes." "When does it stop being convenient?" The silence was brief and complete. "Amira," Yoongi said, with the same weight he'd said it the first time, like a word he'd been holding carefully for 3 years, trying not to wear it out. "It stopped being convenient when you signed your name." Below them, the city kept its lights on, indifferent to endings and beginnings, running its infinite accounts. She stood at the window beside the most dangerous man she'd ever met, who had known her before she knew him, who had watched her hide and waited with what she now understood was not patience but faith. Faith that she would eventually stop running from herself and arrive, finally, at the only version of her life that had ever been large enough to fit her. She had 37 wedding invitations by the door of an apartment she would never go back to. She thought she could do better. She turned from the window. She was done being small. She walked in as leverage and walked out as a queen. If you loved watching Amira stop running and start ruling alongside Yoongi, hit that subscribe button and join the Afro-Korean Storyverse family. We tell stories about women who don't just survive the darkness, they own it. Drop a black heart in the comments if you would have frozen David's accounts too, and I'll see you in the next story. Remember, never let anyone make you small.